Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and let your soul delight.
Shalom Aleichem, Spirit and Truth Seekers, and lovers of Yeshua the Messiah. Welcome to another edition of Waters in the Wilderness, a teaching ministry of Hoshana Rabbah Biblical Discipleship Resources, where it is our joy and privilege to connect the message of the gospel with its pro-Torah Hebrew roots. Here we teach a holistic view of the Bible, the full counsel of His Word to the best of our abilities by the grace of Elohim, and we teach from Genesis to Revelation. And we will continue our journey through the Torah as we today discuss Parashat Akre Mot, which goes from Leviticus 16 verse 1 through Leviticus chapter 18 verse 30. Now I'm not going to spend any time on Leviticus 16. I've covered this before in other video teachings, and that is the rituals that had to do with the biblical holiday, Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, and the sacrifices that occurred on that day, specifically with regard to the scapegoat or the Azazel goat and the other goat, the two goats. And we have discussed this at length. So that chapter is dedicated to the sacrifices that went on that day, and it is a rich discussion that is prophetic, that points to Yeshua, His death on the cross, His atoning death on the cross, and elsewhere I've discussed how that all is prophetic and points forward to Yeshua the Messiah, who fulfilled all points perfectly. They're mentioned in Leviticus 16. The whole gospel message is preached there. But today we're going to talk about something that is a very difficult subject. We're going to begin in Leviticus 17. And I have my commentary notes here. I have very carefully put them together. This is something that is, some may consider this subject to be difficult, maybe macabre, grotesque, but it is here in the Bible for a reason. And many people read this section of Scripture that has to do with exploring the concept of sacrifice, bloodletting, and eating blood, and the purpose of blood, and they go like, it's kind of gory. Why would we want to talk about that? But it is here in the Torah, the book of Leviticus. These are instructions from Yehovah Elohim Himself, and this may seem a little bit irrelevant to our modern culture, but I hope that after this discussion you will see that it is very relevant to some of the things that are going on in our society that used to be kind of swept under the rug or hidden, but are coming out more and more in the open, as we're even reading about some of these practices of the heathens, of the pagans around us, of even the things that are beginning to come out more and more in the open, practices that are going on among those who do not follow a biblical worldview, do not follow the God of the Bible, but they follow the God of this age. His name is Satan, the devil. And we need to be aware of what is going on around us, because our culture is falling more and more, is becoming more and more post-Christian, and adopting more and more heathen, pagan practices, things that I remember as a little child, I would read the National Geographic and see some of the things that some of the very primitive cultures did in faraway places in Africa and South America and in places in Southeast Asia and the like. And now we are beginning to see some of these practices actually taking place in the open, or coming out into the open more and more in our Western society. And we're going to talk about this. So this has to do with us. And I'm going to try to make Leviticus 17 as relevant as possible. So bear with us. We have to discuss some of the cultural background of these things that Leviticus 17, where it's specifically talking about the sanctity of the blood. For Christians, people that believe the Bible, believe in Yeshua the Messiah, the concept of blood with regard to the atoning blood of Yeshua, his death on the cross, his shed blood, this is not a foreign concept to us. But as we go along, we will see that the enemy, Ha-Satan, the devil, Satan, has counterfeited and perverted these things. And the pagans adopted these heathen practices in their worship of their deities and their gods and goddesses, and of even devil worship, which ultimately that is what that is. And that this continues on into our day. Not just among heathens that live in the subcontinent, Sahara continent of Africa, or in the jungles of South America, or some other places in Papua New Guinea or Borneo, or some of those places in Southeast Asia and other places around the world. But we're actually beginning to see some of these heathenistic forbidden practices being practiced allegedly practiced, and is coming out more in the open by movie stars and the Hollywood elite and political elite and some of the financial and corporate elite of this world. Well, they may be elite in the eyes of the world, but they're not an elite in the eyes of Satan the devil, but they are not elite in the eyes of Elohim. They are the dregs. They are the heathens, the Baal worshippers that Yah will eventually come and judge, because they are of the spirit of anti-Messiah, and they follow their father, their God, the devil. So we're going to address this. It's something that needs to come out in the open. It's something that I've been studying, I've been aware of for about 40 years. But now I'm beginning to teach about it. It's not something that I've come to an understanding of lately about these things. But as they come out more and more in our news headlines, I think it's incumbent upon Bible teachers and leaders and pastors and Bible teachers to bring these things out, and we need to be aware of them. So the first part of our discussion on Parashat Remote, and before I get into that, I'd like to call your attention to our online study guides, which I have written and published with the help of my wife. And these are available at hoshanarabah.org. This is the adult Torah study guide version, and it's multi-pages. This particular one is 4 pages long. And I also have one for our teens, our young people. This is called Torah Explorers, and this is also Akre Mode, and that's available on our website, hoshanarabah.org, and you will see a link to the website at the bottom of our page, and also of this YouTube video from time to time. And also you can go to our YouTube channel, and it will take you to hoshanarabah.org, where you can click on Torah Studies and go directly and access and download for free of charge the PDFs of these Torah study guides, which are ideal for individual, group, and congregational study. And they're free of charge. They're my love gift to you. So today, right now, we want to start talking about the verses, Leviticus 17, verses 1 through 14, and exploring the concept of sacrifice and of bloodletting and eating blood. I know that sounds gory. But when we get done with this study, you're going to see, hopefully, the relevance and the importance of this subject. I've spent a lot of time researching this and putting this study together. And I'm going to be referring to my notes here, because I want to say this correctly and succinctly. And I've written things a certain way for a certain reason. And I want to get these ideas out specifically and succinctly, and I want the information to be accurate and correct. So Leviticus 1, I'm not going to read it. I suggest you might go back and read the chapter of Leviticus 17, 1 through 14, where it's talking about the proper killing and slaughtering of animals and sacrifices. And I think a very important verse here is verse 17. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout your generations. Now, there was a proper way and an improper way for the children of Israel under the Torah, the sacrificial system, to sacrifice animals. And there was an improper way, a perverted way that the heathens did. And Yehovah here says that the heathens, what they do, the perverted practices, they're not sacrificing to him, they're sacrificing to demons. And we're going to specifically talk about verse 7 in a little bit. So, but this is important. Demon worship and witchcraft and Satanism and all of these things come into play here. And we're going to talk about that. And they have relevance to what is going on and coming out more and more into the open, even in our modern culture. And it says, verse 11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, for I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. And then verse 14 says, you shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of the flesh is in its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. It was a capital punishment. This is very, very important to Yehovah Elohim, and it's very important that we not pass over these words that are in the Bible, that he gave as instructions for us. And certainly this verse 11 points forward to Yeshua's atoning death on the cross. And so it's very, very relevant to the believer, what we might call the new covenant believer, the believer, the disciple of Yeshua the Messiah. So we want to explore the concept of sacrifice, bloodletting, and eating blood. The sacrificing of animals as an act of worship for any reason is a foreign concept to our modern secularized society. But that was not the case in the ancient biblical world. Concomitant with sacrifices is the idea of free will offerings, which in the ancient world were often made together as an act of worship to the various deities. Now let's give a little bit of biblical background about where sacrifice originated from. It was something that came from Elohim. It wasn't something that originated by the heathens. Satan never originated anything. His followers never originated anything. They always pervert the truth. And the truth that Yehovah Elohim gave to his servants there at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, at the beginning of the creation of mankind. With regard to sacrifices, man's first act of worship outside the Garden of Eden was to make offerings and sacrifices to Elohim. And we read about that in Genesis 4, verses 1 through 4, in the offerings that Cain and Abel brought to Elohim. The next example we find in the book of Genesis was Noah, where he made a sacrifice to Elohim, which was Noah's first act of worship after the flood. And we read that in Genesis 8, verse 20. The same is true of Abraham. Upon receiving the covenant from Elohim in Genesis 12, verse 6, he made an altar and made a sacrifice there. Subsequently, at key points in his journey, in his spiritual journey, Abraham repeated this same act of worship in Genesis 12, 8, 13, 3, and 13, verse 18. At key points in his the same is true of the Israelites who, after receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, made a sacrifice to Elohim as they entered into covenantal agreement with him in Exodus 24, verse 4. So we see that righteous people at certain key points in their spiritual journey as related to their relationship with Yehovah Elohim, they made sacrifices. Subsequently, Yehovah instructed the Israelites to establish an entire sacrificial system as a means to be reconciled to him. That's the Old Testament Levitical sacrificial system, which he commanded them to do. Similarly, animal sacrifices and offerings being made to various deities was an important aspect of the heathen cultures of the biblical world. Even in the first century, the Greeks were still sacrificing animals. And when I say the first century, we're talking about in the New Testament era of the disciples and the apostles. Even in the first century, the Greeks were still sacrificing animals to their pagan temples, to their gods and goddesses. And we read about that in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 13, and in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20, where it talks about meat sacrificed to idols. And the Jews, prior to the destruction of their temple in AD 70, the Jews were still making sacrifices. And we read about that in Acts 21, verse 24. And actually there, the Apostle Paul goes and he makes a sacrifice. He was coming out of his Nazirite vow, and he didn't really need to do that, but he did that as an act of his showing his devotion to and adherence to Torah. And we read about that particular sacrifice of the Nazirite in Numbers 6, verse 13 through 21. So in the mind of the ancients, what was the purpose of sacrifice? I'm not talking about the Israelites, but I'm talking more about the heathen cultures. The ritual killing and offering of an animal was part of a religious ritual either to appease or to gain the favor of a deity. Now that's not the case with Yehovah Elohim and the children of Israel. The purpose of that was for atoning for sin. But for the pagans, it was to gain the favor of a deity or to appease the rage or the wrath of a deity that might come against them. With this concept in mind, that is, the concept of sacrifice, several points should be noted. Man's rebellion and sin against Elohim in the Garden of Eden, which is called the fall of man, was what happened at that time was man was cut off from his Creator, and as a result, incurred the Creator's judgment against man's sin. The Garden of Eden and the fall of man event is part of the mythos of many ancient civilizations. So the fall of man of the Garden of Eden finds itself in many of the ancient mythologies. You go way back, and the mythology of the ancient Mesopotamians and the Sumerians and the Greeks and the Indians and the Muslims and most likely the Babylonians, Chaldeans, Persians, Egyptians, Assyrians, Ethiopians, Mexicans, and even the Chinese had this idea about man sinning coming into the world, man living in a garden, an idyllic situation, and falling out of favor with deity because of his wrongdoing. And thus this idea of man's separation from deity because of his sin informed the ancients of their need to be reconciled to deity. However, it stands to reason that as men moved further down history's timeline and away from the actual event of the fall of the Garden of Eden, as hundreds of years pass and even thousands of years pass, and then along with the truth that man's need for atoning blood sacrifice and the pure worship of Elohim through sacrifice became at the same time blurry in men's minds and corrupted, and also corrupted by demonic incursion and influences, and by man-made traditions. So as man moved further away in their ancient traditions and mythologies, the history of what actually took place in the Garden of Eden got blurry and got obscured and got perverted and got twisted even by demonic influences. It's kind of like the old when we were kids, we played the old telephone thing where you get a long line of people sitting in a row of chairs or standing in a line, and you whisper something into, let's say like a sentence or a phrase, into the ear of the first person. and then that person whispers it to the next person, and the next person, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 people down the line. And what comes out at the end, what the last person repeats that he heard, usually is something completely different than what was originally spoken into the ear of the first person. Well, this is the same thing. Yehovah gave his truth to to Adam and Eve and Noah and Shem and Abraham and the patriarchs and so forth. But little by little, these truths got perverted by the heathens around them. And so you end up with a whole different religious system. And instead of where they're worshiping Elohim, now they're worshiping gods and goddesses and demons and have all kinds of perversions. As a result, men began to worship counterfeit deities of their own concoction that ran cross-grained to or were outright antithetical to the strictures, to the instructions of Yehovah Elohim with regard to offerings and sacrifices. Instead of men making sacrifices and offerings to be reconciled to Elohim because of sin, the heathens made sacrifices to appease the anger of their false gods and at the same time to curry the favor of their false gods for fortune, for fame, for spiritual power, and long life. Over time, man's sin and his need to be reconciled to the Creator was no longer the focal point of the sacrifice or offering. The Israelites, under Yehovah's guidance, however, on the other hand, kept in view the true purpose of sacrifice. It was for the purpose of atonement for sin in order to reconcile sinful and fallen man to his Creator, which we just read in Leviticus 17, verse 11. Let me read this again. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I, that's Yehovah Elohim, the Creator, have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. And as we know, that these were prophetic shadow pictures that pointed forward to Yeshua's once and for all death on the cross as an atonement for man's sins. Now, as the biblical narrative reveals, the ancient Israelites were all too easily swayed by the heathen, Canaanite, Baal-worshipping, devil-worshipping cultures around them, whose gods and goddesses had moral stringencies much less demanding than those of Elohim as laid out in his Torah, and who instead of forbidding sinful acts, that is the gods and goddesses, who instead of forbidding sinful acts not only tolerated but often promoted them, even incorporating them into their cults' rituals or their heathen temple practices, their rituals, religious rituals, which involve ritual temple prostitution and other forms of sexual deviance, including homosexuality and lesbianism and pedophilia, and the list goes, human sacrifice, child sacrifice, and the list goes on. This is why Yehovah's Torah included strict commands against Israel's fraternizing in any way with the neighboring Baal-worshipping heathen Canaanites, or adopting any of their religious rituals, especially those involving blood and sacrifice, since the Creator originally designed these rituals to be only for worship, atonement, and reconciliation purposes. With this historical backdrop in view, it is easier to see why Yehovah was so adamant that the Israelites adhere to his strict protocols with regard to making animal sacrifices and offering up offerings, while at the same time he prohibited them from following the heathens' perverted versions of these rituals that had devolved into outright demon worship, which we just read in Leviticus 17 verse 7, where he talks about the heathens make their sacrifices to demons and play the harlot. In other words, they become spiritual whores and prostitutes by leaving the true worship of Elohim and going after these false gods and goddesses. It's like a wife leaving her husband and going whoring after another man. This is what the ancient people had done. They had left the truth of Elohim and gone whoring after gods and goddesses and idols and worshiping the devil, basically. And Yehovah did not want his people to do the same thing. So let's bring this up to the present time, now that we have a little bit of historical background, and how does this relate to us and what we see going on in the heathen culture, the Baal worshiping, the increasingly Baal worshiping culture going on around us in our society, even in our so-called modern, up-to-date 21st century society. What do we see going on? So this begs the question, despite the technical advancements and secularization of our modern society, human nature has not changed from ancient times till now. Yes, we may be wearing different clothing, we may live in more modern times, we have technology and so forth and so on, but human nature, the human heart, the human mind, the inclination towards sin, the carnal nature of man, the base nature that draws man like gravity, pulls man downward into the pit to want to do the base things, the sin, all of that has not changed. Although modern man no longer offers animal sacrifices, or do they? But generally speaking, modern man no longer offers animal sacrifices for the purpose of appeasing or garnering favor with some invisible deity. What practices do modern men engage in instead to achieve the same benefits? That is, assuaging of guilt brought on by sin, seeking the favor of some ideological deity, seeking fame, fortune, long life, or power, as the ancients did when sacrificing to their demons. As we will go on, there are actually people today back in the hidden places, under the table, so to speak, back in the dark rooms, underground places, both physically and metaphorically, where there is still sacrifice that goes on. Both human, animal, and human. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. One example of an improper sacrifice would be human sacrifice, which the Bible strongly forbids in the next chapter. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but in Leviticus 18 verse 21, it says here, and you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Moloch, nor shall you profane the name of your Elohim. I am Yehovah. So they would actually, as an offering to their gods, they would burn them in the fire to the Canaanite god Moloch. And often they would make their children pass through the fire. This was infant sacrifice. This was a common practice in the ancient world in that area. It happened in many ancient cultures, not just those that worshipped Moloch. But it was a practice of those that worshipped Baal or Baal. The Phoenicians practiced it. And we could go on and on. If you look up child sacrifice, you will on the internet, you can read a lot about that. So, a modern version of child sacrifice would be abortion. Human sacrifice, especially that of a newborn or young innocent child in ancient times and among modern devil worshippers, or to put it in biblical terms, Satan worshipping Baal worshippers, which exist today on this earth, was and is believed to spiritually empower those performing the sacrifice. Similarly, the practice of abortion or the killing of an innocent child supposedly empowers the practitioner with the misguided promise of eliminating the effects and the guilt of an unwanted pregnancy and the financial and lifestyle burdens and encumbrances resulting therefrom. Therefore, abortion holds out the promise of financial prosperity, that is, by not having to pay the high cost of raising a child, and freedom from the responsibility of raising a child, all the while giving people the freedom of unlimited sex or pleasure, hedonism, without the consequences of unwanted children. So yes, abortion is the practice, modern day practice, of child sacrifice. Now the pro-life, pro-abortion crowd has lied and told people that life does not begin until the baby comes out of the womb. And we know that to be a lie from the pit of hell. It is demonic. And there are many, life begins at conception. And they've tried to remove the guilt from those who practice abortion by promoting this lie. But people that kill their children still carry a guilt and shame. They bury it, but it goes with them the rest of their life because they cannot take that away because they have murdered and they have violated Elohim's laws. Now there can be forgiveness for those who do it unknowingly, unwittingly, and they can come to the cross and be forgiven of their sin and be set free from that shame and that guilt. But it is murder, and it is a form of child sacrifice. If you look into how abortion takes place, it is modern day worship of Moloch. Moloch was the god of prosperity, the god of sexual pleasure, the god of fortune and fame, and this is exactly what many people, if not most, if not all, who choose to murder their child by having an abortion, that's what they're seeking. They're seeking freedom from responsibility. They're seeking fortune by not having to pay to raise a child, and they are seeking pleasure because they can have all the sex that they want with whomever, whenever, however, without the consequences of raising a child. Now let's talk about the concept of blood drinking, human sacrifice, and eventually pedophilia. This chapter in Leviticus chapter 17, also forbids the improper shedding of blood and the drinking of blood. And we will see in a minute that blood drinking, human sacrifice, and pedophilia, as well as ritual sex, all go hand in hand together. And let's say, might be called satanic ritual sex. Today, some Satanists, or what I would call modern Baal worshippers, believe that the drinking of human or animal blood promotes longevity of life, imbues the drinker with supernatural energy and power, and brings him to a higher spiritual plane, since the blood carries the life energy of a person. They believe that a living body, human or animal, is a storehouse of energy, and that by drinking the blood from something or someone that has just been killed, energy transference occurs from the victim to the recipient. It is believed that the healthier the younger and the purer the victim, the more energy the victim possesses and the more potential for attaining a higher level of power for the blood drinker. I'm sorry if this offends some of you and some of your sensitivities, but we need to be aware of these things. This is in the Bible. These principles, these practices were condemned by Elohim in the Bible, and the heathen cultures around the Israelites practiced these things. Even as the heathen cultures around the believers in the Bible, the disciples of Yeshua the Messiah, the modern day Israel of Elohim, to quote Paul from Galatians 6:16, the followers of Elohim, those that follow and obey the Bible, these practices take place around us today, hidden and becoming more unhidden and coming out in the open as time goes on. So a young, healthy virgin is preferred since their energy has not been dissipated yet. Drinking blood is a form of spiritual vampirism, parasitizing the life out of one person or animal for the benefit of another person. Sex magic and pedophilia go hand in hand with the practice of blood drinking. The belief among occult practitioners or at least some, I wouldn't say all occult practitioners, but those that do this, is that the moment sexual energy is released, that would be at the time of orgasm, sexual orgasm, blood should be let. It's called bloodletting. And drunk, since that at that moment it contains the highest energy potential, and there's a term for it called adrenalized blood. Adrenalized blood at that moment. The blood carries the most energy, and therefore supposedly the most benefit, the highest benefit for the blood drinker. Sexually abusing and then sacrificing children in this manner is supposed to bring maximum benefits to the host as they siphon off and then consume the child's pure essence, soul energy, and life force for their own benefit. Now I'm reading over these things quickly, but stop for a moment and think about it. I've done a lot of research over many, many years into these things. So I know that what I'm sharing with you is a condensed version of much research. It's time that Bible teachers begin to talk about these things. It's going on all around us, and it's going to become more prevalent and become out more and more out into the open as time goes on. It's just the way things are. It's the way things are going. 30, 40 years ago when I was young, there are things happening today that we would never have guessed would be out in the open. Sexual perversions of all kinds being flaunted and marched in our streets, being crammed down our children in the public school institutions, at our institutions of higher learning or maybe lower learning, being promoted by the government, being not only promoted but advertised and being lauded, praised by many of our leaders and by government officials, and even making its way into the Christian church. So this is going to come. It's going to get worse because we have turned our back on Elohim. We have turned our back on the Bible. Our society has kicked God out of the schools, prayer out of the schools, and God out of our political system and Elohim. And we have now are desecrating the Bible and beginning to persecute as a society those who follow the Bible, censoring them and doing everything they can to censor and to suppress the truth of the Bible and the message of the gospel. Now we talk about drinking adrenalized blood. Well, U.S. scientists have reported that infusing young blood, called vampire therapy, and I'm not making this up, improves health. This practice reportedly can repair muscle tissue, the liver, and can firm up sagging facial and breast tissue, according to the British newspaper, the Daily Mail Online news source, in an article dated November 22nd, 2016. If you Google that, I actually have the URL here. I read the article myself. It's online. But the name of the article is "Dracula Was Right. Infusing young blood improves health and won't make won't make you younger." That's the name of the article. That's the title of the article, and you can look it up. Guys, this is sick and disgusting. You need to think about these things. Don't just pass it over, but think about them and ask Yah what He wants your attitude to be and your response to be about these things. Let's just not pass over. Many innocent children and people are disappearing in our society, and they're being used for these nefarious, wicked practices. And it happened in ancient times and has continued down through the ages. Satan worship and all of that has not changed. It's now coming out in the open more because we have a society that's more open to these things and more accepting of these things, including cannibalism. We won't discuss that at this point. but we need to think about them and not bury our head in the sand, act like it's not happening. Go research it out for yourself. You have the ability to get this information at your fingertips from reputable, reliable sources and multiple sources if you will simply verify what I'm saying. Now let's talk about cutting oneself. Cutting oneself. This is a practice that's happening more and more among many people. The cutting of oneself for blood is something that I cannot wrap my brain around. But it gave rise back in the 90s, and maybe earlier than that, the self-mutilation that began to give rise in the late 70s and early 80s and Europe, and began to move into the United States maybe in the early 90s with the Gothic movement and the self-mutilation and the punk rock scene and all that. And it went from there. When it is not possible to perform human or animal sacrifices, satanic practitioners will work themselves into a frenzy, then cut themselves until the blood flows in order to summon demonic powers. This is what the prophets of Baal did in the showdown on Mount Carmel with Elijah the prophet. And we read about that in 1 Kings 18, verse 25 to 28. And verse 28 records that these Baal-worshipping prophets, when they cut themselves to summon their demons to come down and to consume the sacrifice on the altar there, in this power showdown between Baal, or Satan, and the Elohim of Israel, that it was they cut themselves. They took sharp instruments and they cut themselves until they bled. And it says there in verse 28 that this was their custom. To summon their demon gods, this was their custom. This means that cutting themselves was a ritual they habitually practiced to summon demonic power. The Bible provides another example of this practice in Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verse 5, where Yeshua encountered the Gadarene demoniac, who had a legion of demons in him. And it says there that the demoniac would cut himself with stones, presumably to excite demonic activity in himself, to summon demons, because demons are drawn by blood. This is what it says here in Leviticus 17. It talks about properly disposing of blood and not making improper sacrifices as the heathens do to summon the demons. We just read this here. They shall no more offer their sacrifice to demons after whom they have played the harlot. So the heathens would make animal sacrifices, human sacrifices, or cut themselves, and they would even drink blood, we'll talk about that in a minute, in order to summon demons. This is why Yehovah was so adamant that his people not go down this path. You say, oh, I could never do that. Well, hopefully that's true, but a lot of people do. And it's becoming more and more acceptable in this culture. Just look at abortion. Look at people cutting themselves. And we're going to talk about tattoos here in a minute. Don't turn this off. Okay, if you've gotten a tattoo, there's forgiveness. But tattooing is another aspect of this. We'll talk about that in a minute. Don't shut this video off. You need to know the truth. If you really want to be pleasing in the eyes of Elohim and do what he says, you need to know the truth and not engage in these heathen practices. Interestingly, the Torah forbids the heathen practice of cutting the flesh to conjure up demons or the spirits of the dead. Let's turn this. Let's go to Leviticus just a few verses later, a few chapters later. Leviticus 21, verses 5 through 6. Leviticus 21, 5 through 6. You shall not make any bald place on their heads, nor shall they shave the edges of their beards. Talking about the men here. Nor shall any cuttings in their flesh. They shall be holy to their Elohim and not profane the name of their Elohim, for they offer the offerings of Elohim made by fire, and the bread of their Elohim. Therefore they shall be holy. So here he's forbidding the Israelites from cutting themselves. Well, you say, well, I don't cut myself. Well, this was a demonic practice. And it's mentioned again in Deuteronomy 14 verse 1. All these practices involve the letting of blood, whether through sacrifice, drinking blood, or cutting oneself. Now, akin to cutting oneself is the making of tattoos, which the Bible also forbids, while at the same time juxtaposing this practice with the cutting of one's flesh for the dead. Leviticus 19:28. So a couple chapters later, it talks about this. Leviticus 19:28. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead. That is to conjure up the spirits of the dead, or demonic spirits. That's what this is for. To conjure up demonic spirits. Because there was a lot of ancestor worship that went on. People worshipped, in these pagan cultures, they worshipped their ancestors. It's called necromancy. And they would conjure up the spirits. They weren't literally the spirits of their dead ancestors. They were demonic spirits. That's what happened with the witch of Endor. She conjured up a lying spirit in the form of Samuel, who then prophesied to Saul when he was there in a state of apostasy. So, I mean, you know, Yah forbade that practice. It says here, Leviticus 19 verse 28, you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am Yehovah, your Elohim. Do not, let's read a couple more verses. Do not prostitute your daughters to cause her to be a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry and the land become full of wickedness. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am Yehovah, your Elohim. Give no regard to mediums and to familiar spirits. Do not seek after them to be defiled by them. I am Yehovah, your Elohim. So here we see necromancy, conjuring up the dead, worshiping familiar spirits, seeking wizards or witches, sorcerers, fortune tellers, these kind of people, and not cutting oneself for the dead in order to conjure up demons. Let's talk about tattooing, how that relates to the cutting of oneself. Ancient tattooing practices involved cutting the skin with a sharp object, then rubbing soot, like soot, into the wound mark, and therefore you have a permanent mark. Modern tattooing with a needle or a tattoo machine still punctures the skin, causing small amounts of bleeding or bloodletting from each puncture wound. And Yah forbids this. So when a person gets a tattoo, there's a machine or needle, but now they have tattoo machines that make a lot of little punctures, and they have to wipe the blood. Little droplets of blood come out of each place, each puncture, and they have to wipe it down with alcohol to wipe off the blood and to sterilize it. But blood is let. And then a little scab forms over the top, and then eventually a scar forms, or it heals itself. But it's a modern form of bloodletting, and Yehovah says don't do that, because the letting of blood potentially can conjure up demons. They're attracted to that, and that's a whole other discussion as to why. But we'll save that for another discussion. Yehovah forbids both tattooing and the cutting of the flesh in the same verse, which is evidence that Yehovah links these two practices and views them as heathen occult rituals. Again, self-mutilation in any form is a blood ritual and is a heathen practice and often associated with conjuring up demons, as we see that was going on with the Baal-worshipping false prophets there in 1 Kings 18:28, when that showdown between Elijah the prophet and the 400 prophets of Baal. Moreover, the letting of blood is an important aspect of the so-called satanic black mass, because it is believed that the shedding of blood unleashes great spiritual power for the benefit of those living. Although there is no standardized black mass ritual, one concept of this satanic practice is to mock the Roman Catholic Mass by corrupting or inverting the symbolisms. The Catholic Mass has as its focal point the concept of transubstantiation. This is the idea that when one eats of the communion sacraments, of the bread and the wine, they turn into the literal body, the blood and body of Yeshua, thus empowering the recipient spiritually. For some practitioners of the Black Mass, the Catholic Mass is mocked by drinking actual human or animal blood and eating the flesh of a sacrificed animal or human, purportedly for the purpose of gaining supernatural spiritual power. If you don't believe what I'm saying, do some research. Talk to people or read the testimonies of people that have come out of these things. Read the do your own research and prove what I'm saying is true. And I'm trying to tag the bases by showing that in the Bible this was a practice. These were practices that went on. And we see little bits and pieces of it to give credence to the validity of what I'm saying. That it was something that Elohim did not want his people to do. Now the shedding, drinking, desecrating of human blood, or even cannibalism, is a satanic concept that goes back to the worship of Baal. In the Bible, there are indications that the Baal-worshipping Canaanites, known as the Anakim, who were the giants and descendants of the fallen angel Nephilim of Genesis 6, 2 through 4 of fame, were actually cannibals. We read in Numbers 13, verses 32 and 33, that the land of these people, that is, the Canaanites, devours its inhabitants. The word devours in Hebrew literally means eats its inhabitants. It's the basic Hebrew word that means to eat. I believe it's the word amar. I may be wrong about it, but I think it's the basic verb that means to eat. And you know, it can be literal. It can mean literally eat food, or it can be figurative as well, like a lot of words that we in Hebrew as well as in English. So whether this is meant literally or figuratively is hard to say. But the ancient book of 1 Enoch informs us that the Nephilim were human, flesh-eating, and blood-drinking cannibals. 1 Enoch 7, 13 through 14. I'm not going to discuss the book of Enoch, but it is a historical book that, like the book of Maccabees, it's not inspired, does not belong in the Bible, but it was a historic book, a historical record, like the writings of Josephus and some other first century and intertestamental books. And we see the book of Enoch either directly quoted in the Bible a couple times in the New Testament, or probably a few dozen references to verbiage, analogous verbiage, references back to the book of Enoch, both in the Gospels and in the writings of the Apostles, and also in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in some of the intertestamental books. We find references to the book of Enoch and quotes therefrom. So we know that it is an ancient book, and it seems to have been given credence by the first, for the Second Temple Jewish sages as well as the apostles. I'm not going to get into that anymore. You can go read books like by Dr. Michael Heiser and others who have gone into, done an excellent job. And in fact, I'm going to pull his book down right here. It's called Reversing Herman by Dr. Michael Heiser. He's a Christian theologian, highly respected, and I would encourage you to take a look at his book. And there's others that have written on this as well, other academics who are professors and linguistic scholars that have gone into the ancient sources. But this book is called Reversing Herman. It just came out in 2017, and for those of you that want to look into that, is well referenced, footnoted, and a lot of bibliographic notes therein. Everything is referenced and footnoted. So you can check that out for yourself. Moreover, the Bible reveals that Satan is the first liar and murderer. Yeshua said that in John 8:44, that he was a murderer from the beginning. So we're talking about cannibalism, and the followers of Satan, Baal worshiper, devil worshippers, being cannibalistic in nature, some of them. So we see that Satan was the first liar, and he's a murderer, and he hates humans and wants to destroy them in John 10:10 and 1 Peter 5:8. He's like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Satan's human servants similarly are waging a war to control the world for Satan and for them to rule. To accomplish their goals, they must control people, if not shed the blood of as many people as possible, especially Bible believers. Look at the religion that is one of the fastest growing religions in the world, and is second only to Christianity in the numbers of people that claim to follow the adherents of that religion. The religion of Edom, the dominant religion of the Middle East. In their unholy book, read what they say should be the fate of the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians. They are to be murdered and tortured and raped and pillaged and crucified and dismembered and beheaded. And that is going on in the Middle East today, and wherever this religion is being exported. Some of the adherents of that religion, not all of them, but some of them, if they follow their unholy demonic book, if they follow literally what it says, and I've read it from cover to cover, and it says that they will be practicing these things. And this is exactly what ISIS is doing and others are doing today. To anybody and everybody, especially the Christians, who oppose them. So when these people do this, they are paying homage to their satanic masters, to Satan, who is a murderer from the beginning. Now the difference between Satan and Yeshua, there are many differences, but one of the main differences between Satan and Yeshua, the Messiah, is that Satan wants his servants to shed their blood and that of other humans for him, and even to die for him. While on the other hand, Yeshua died shedding his blood for his servants, that they might have their sins forgiven and experience eternal life. This is the essence of the gospel message. Satan and his evil servants have turned the gospel message of life and the shedding of blood for sins and redemption of mankind and reconciliation on its head and perverted it. So now this concept of blood atonement, of reconciliation and redemption, and reversing the curse that occurred at the fall of man at the Garden of Eden when he sinned. Instead, Satan has twisted this whole thing, revolving around the blood atonement, and turned it into something that condemns and damns human beings to the lake of fire, to eternal judgment. Those who practice those things, who do not repent of that. And it damns them, all the while promising them life, fortune, fame, power, sexual indulgence, and the like. You know, Satan has always been very good about over-promising and under-delivering. That is not the case with Yeshua. He doesn't over-promise and under-deliver. In fact, the Bible says that eye hath not seen nor ear heard, nor has entered the heart of man the things that Jehovah has prepared for those who serve him and love him and obey him. So when we serve and obey Jehovah Elohim, he asks a little. He asks for our heart. He asks that we serve and obey him and not follow the ways of the heathen. But he promises eternal life. He promises eternity as his sons and daughters in his kingdom. That means you cannot serve two masters. Satan, Baal, or your own personal god and goddess that's behind which is a demon. You can't serve that one. And Yeshua, Yehovah Elohim, at the same time. It's impossible. Now let's take a look at Leviticus 17, verse 7. And I'm going to read this verse for you. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. So this is talking about the children of Israel. And if you read the verses prior to this, it is talking, and we've discussed that previously, talking about making proper sacrifices according to Yehovah's instructions, and doing so in a way that does not conjure up demons or cause people to go astray by following the practices of the heathens. But what I want to talk about here is the sacrifice to demons. The word demons here in Leviticus 17 verse 7 is the Greek or the Hebrew word sa'ar. S-A-apostrophe-A-R. Sa'ar. And it's the Hebrew word for goat. And if you do some research, you will see that this refers to the Egyptian goat god, or the goat demons that were believed to inhabit the wilderness. In several places, such as the King James Version of the Bible and New American Standard, the word satyr, S-A-T-Y-R, is used in place of the word sa'ar. The word sa'ar is the Hebrew word, but they translated the Hebrew word sa'ar into satyr. We also see the same word sa'ar used in Isaiah 13:21 and 34 verse 14. And this satyr is the Greek, it was prominent in Greek and Roman mythology and was associated with Pan, the half-goat and half-man-like creature. These demonic forces were believed to be destructive, causing fear and turbulence, murder and mayhem. Interesting, Sa'ar and Seir, S-E-apostrophe-I-R, as in Mount Seir. Some of you, if you look up in your concordance or a biblical search program, you will see that Mount Seir is mentioned many, many times, such as Numbers 24 verse 18, as the home of Edom. Now, Edom is another name for Esau. Esau was the brother of Jacob, the twin brother of Jacob, and the son of Isaac and Rebekah. And Edom, or Esau, he intermarried with Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham through Hagar, and the half-brother of Isaac. And Ishmael is believed by the Arabs, by the Muslims, to be their spiritual father. And they trace their lineage back to him, if you go and study about Islam. And Edom, or Esau, intermarried into the family of Ishmael. One of his wives was the daughter of Ishmael. So some of the descendants of Edom became the Edomites, and they're the ones that currently live, they're known as the Palestinians, they live in that area around the modern day nation of Israel. And they were the perpetual enemy in ancient biblical times of the nation of Israel. Edom, if you look it up, Edom was always trying to kill Israel and dispossess them of their land. The word Seir, as in Mount Seir, as the home of Edom, derives from, and Sa'ar, Seder, derived from the same root word. From this, the Jewish sages deduced that Edom, or who are the descendants of Esau, who were Israel's perpetual enemies down through the ages, even to the last days, was the embodiment of evil. Additionally, in occult lore, there exists a creature called Baphomet. B-A-P-H-O-M-E-T. Maybe you've seen that. Which is represented by a horned goat's head inside of an inverted star or pentagram. There is an ongoing, it's called the goat's head. And you've seen that. You see that making its, raising its ugly head, its evil head, if you will, in Hollywood circles and in different icons here and there among celebrities. You'll find them dressing up in these costumes that represent these things, or wearing symbologies of the Baphomet. But it's the horned goat head inside of an inverted star or pentagram. There is an ongoing debate whether this symbol goes back to the Seder or is more recent, is of more recent origination. However, it is well documented the use of blood in sacrificial and cannibalistic rites, and its veneration is an important aspect of satanic rituals even in modern times. This is one reason why Yehovah forbade the Israelites from eating animal blood in verse 10. So in verse 7, we see where he forbids the sacrifice be made to demons or to the satyr or to goat demons. He's called that, if you do that, that's going into spiritual harlotry. And then 2 verses, well, let me just say, let me read the rest of it. Let me read this whole thing. Verse 7, Leviticus 17, verse 7. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them there throughout their generations. Verse 8. Also you shall say to them, whatever man of the house of Israel or the stranger who dwells among you who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of a meeting to offer it to Yehovah, that man shall be cut off from his people. And whatever man of the house of Israel or the strangers who dwell among you who eats any blood, it's a form of cannibalism, I will set my face against. Well, it wasn't cannibalism unless you ate human blood, but it was forbidden to eat animal blood. Anyone who eats any blood, period, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. So this whole idea of eating blood is tied to the worship of the goat demon, who we see the modern embodiment of that as Baphomet, which is a picture of Satan. It all goes back to the Bible. All goes back to the Torah. And there's nothing new under the sun. All of these modern satanic occultic things, we can take them all back to the Bible. The roots are there. Back to the heathens, the devil-worshipping heathens that lived in the land of Israel, around the Israelites, and that the Israelites were to not follow their heathen practices, and they were to dispossess these demon worshippers of their land and to kill them. These were the only ones that Yehovah told the Israelites to kill, was these devil-worshipping demoniacs. They were not to kill the Egyptians or the Babylonians or anybody else. They were to win them to Yehovah through example. They were only to commit genocide on those people those demon-possessed people. They were so demon-possessed that they were sacrificing their children, eating flesh, drinking the blood, worshipping devils, involved in the most heinous, grotesque, wicked sexual practices, and the list goes on. Now, analogous to this prohibition on eating the blood is the next verse, which we didn't read, and we'll read that now. Leviticus 17, verse 11. Why does he, among other reasons, why does Yehovah, or maybe principle of which, among other reasons, that Yehovah forbids his people from eating the blood of a sacrificed animal, is for this reason. verse 11 of Leviticus 17. Yes, Leviticus 17, verse 11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any stranger who dwells among you eat blood. And he repeats that again in end of verse 14. You shall not eat the blood of any animal, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. Elohim, when he says something once, that's pretty important. But when he says it several times, 2 or 3 times, as he said in verse 10, so it's mentioned 3 times in this chapter, it's like this is like for emphasis. He is very adamant about not eating the blood. So, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Long before modern science confirmed this in the 17th century, that the blood is a carrier of life in a living organism, Yehovah revealed in the Torah that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Leviticus 17:11 is a crucial scripture theologically regarding the blood atonement. Presently, the Jewish religion offers no hope for its followers in light of this passage, since Judaism denies the only means by which humans can have their sins atoned for, namely through the blood of Yeshua the Messiah. For believers in Yeshua, the message of the Messiah and Him crucified addresses this issue. The importance of the blood of the Lamb of Yehovah, that's Yeshua the Messiah, in the atonement for sin, as well as in overcoming sin, sickness, and the powers of hell, 1 Peter 2:24 and Revelation 12:11, cannot be overemphasized. The shedding of blood improperly can attract demons, but the blood of Yeshua overcomes and defeats demons, Revelation 12:11 says. Amazing. How thorough is your understanding of the power of the blood of Yeshua? Do you appropriate this power on a regular basis in your life? It says in Revelation 12:11, and they overcame Satan, that is the end time saints, by the word of their testimony. The power of Yeshua's blood, the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. The blood of Yeshua, when appropriated spiritually into our lives, and we do that when we take communion at Passover every year. We appropriate that, and we identify with that, and we stay under the blood that washes away our sins, so that the devil has no legal hold on us spiritually by bringing the power of death upon us, because the wages of sin is death. And if we're under Yeshua's blood, then that death penalty is null and void, is gone. He took it for us at the cross, and that's the basic message of the gospel. So do you appropriate this power on a regular basis in your life? The power of the blood is central to the efficacy of the communion elements, specifically to the concept of redemption. The concept of the blood of Yeshua is central to the gospel message, with more than 50 references to it in the testimony of Yeshua, or the New Testament, to the blood of Yeshua. Such terms as are used as the blood of the Lamb, that is in the New Testament, or the testimony of Yeshua. The blood of the Lamb, the blood of Messiah, the precious blood of Messiah, the blood of the everlasting covenant, redemption through Messiah's blood, the blood of His cross, the communion of the blood of the Messiah, faith in His blood, and purchased with His blood. In the reality of the blood of Messiah, is the reality of the blood of Messiah central to your faith walk? How so? If not, why? And I would encourage you to read and to ponder Matthew 26, verse 28, Ephesians 1, verse 7, Hebrews 9, verse 12, Hebrews 9 verse 22. Hebrews 10:19. Hebrews 12:24. 1 Peter 1:2 and 1 Peter 1:19. 1 John 1:7. Revelation 1:5. Revelation 7:14 and Revelation 12:11.
Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat.